Here we are, and this will be interesting because this is going to be our first remote speaker, Dr. Amy Jackson, University of Nottingham. So, a glimpse into the future. Amy has over 35 years' experience in agriculture, including 25 in public relations. This includes working on livestock and arable farms in the UK and Canada for agriculture and mainstream, UK top 5 PR agencies, and nearly 4 years as head of communications at the GB, Milk Development Council Levy Board. Great Britain, I hope, is GB, I'm thinking. For much of the last 12 years, she's specialised in issues and crisis management, being involved in high-profile stories such as horse meat, labour exploitation, mega farms and antibiotic use. Latterly, she has completed a PhD from the University of Nottingham's Vet School, examining public preferences for dairy cow management in the UK. We welcome Amy to our screens, and today I think it's quite early in the morning. It's probably 7 or 6 or something, so thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Amy Jackson.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, it's 6 o'clock in the morning here, and it's -2, so it's a bit of a chilly day. But thank you very much for having me speak today. So I'm going to talk about the reputational pressures facing UK dairy and a bit about how we address them. And as you outlined in my introduction, my background is practical farming, but also then latterly PR issues and crisis management. And my research that I've done over the last 4 to 5 years has really helped me think differently about the challenges we face reputationally and how we tackle them, because the situation appears to be getting worse rather than better at the moment. So just a little bit to start with about the UK and its dairy issues. And I'm sorry if this is a bit Jack and Jill, but I quite often find if I'm speaking to an overseas audience that there's a bit of confusion about our country and the different bits of it, and GB, UK, and so on. So just to kick off, this obviously is our islands, and I'm sorry if this is basic, but this is Scotland, England, Wales, and together they form Great Britain, GB. We add Northern Ireland in, and that gives us the UK. And just to give you a bit of a profile of how the UK operates in terms of its dairy industry, there's a lot of figures there, but what I think, looking at your Victorian dairy industry as a comparison, rather than the whole of Australia, because it's hugely different. So if we knock it down to Victoria, we've got about 10 times the number of people you have in Victoria. Our land mass is slightly bigger, and we have slightly more dairy cows than there are in Victoria. And we have a lot more dairy farmers. So the average herd size is a lot lower in the UK. So we have about 12,000 dairy farmers still, about 150 cows in the average herd. Our average yields are just over 8,000 litres per cow in the UK. We have a lot more intensive systems, if you like. We feed, tend to house and feed in the winter. And about 80% of the herds have access to pasture, but I would say that probably it's about 70% of cows, because the herds that house cows year round tend to be the larger herds. And our market is largely domestic. I mean, still almost a third of our milk goes into liquid milk for domestic consumption, and 25% into cheese, a lot of which is consumed domestically as well as exported. So that's a bit of a rundown of our industry. So there are some similarities in terms of the market, the setup in Victoria, but we are more of a domestic market probably rather than export based at the moment. The issues we're facing in the UK are probably similar to those facing any developed dairy country around the world, led by animal welfare and ethics as a key issue. And this is not just a focus on content or bad practice, malpractice, but it's now increasingly a focus on standard practices as well. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, air and water quality, including ammonia. We have quite a concentrated country with a large population, and this means that dairy is very much at the interface of the public, that the two are very close together. People live very close to farms. We have a lot of pressure on air and water quality, as a lot of other countries do in Europe. There's also concerns over the health and nutrition of dairy, and some of the reports we've seen coming out recently, such as the Eat Lancet and Global Burden of Disease, is concerning that people are talking about the health and nutrition of dairy in negative ways. And we also have a lot of issues with land use, competition, housing, golf courses, energy, solar arrays are really beginning to push farmers off the land here. So that's creating planning challenges, and also, of course, the challenge we have from increasingly affordable, tasty alternatives to dairy, which haven't really been a problem in the past, but increasingly are now. I'm going to mainly focus on animal welfare and ethics today because that's kind of the focus of what I've been looking at. But I think some of the things I'm going to talk about also relate then to how we deal with challenges, reputational challenges around climate change and air and water quality. Now, I'm just going to pop back a bit to my career in issues in crisis management. And about 12 years ago, I was involved in this really, really contentious application to set up an 8,000 cow dairy farm in Lincolnshire, which is a very arable cropping area in the east of the country, not used to having cows. But this was a plan in a kind of US style system to put cows and livestock back in an arable area, and to have a sort of circular system with the farmers growing crops and putting the digestate from anaerobic digestion back onto the crops. So it was quite a holistic plan. Caused huge challenges. It first brought to light the fact that people may keep cows inside year round, that some cows don't graze. And it was across all national media, broadcast, print, got a huge amount of attention globally. This project didn't happen. It eventually was withdrawn. But what's interesting is it left me wondering, what is it we're getting wrong? And now, 12 years later, the situation is no better. In fact, it's getting worse. And this was a bit of a watershed moment about a year ago now, which was on Panorama, which is a main primetime BBC show, which is current affairs show. And this was an expose of dairy, a particular dairy farm where they were using hip clamps. The practices were poor practice, bad practice. And it was really the fact that this gained that interest at that time of the day in this kind of media. It was a real wake-up call that we really do need to think about what we're doing and how it comes across to the public. So just to think about what is happening here and what does it mean, one of the factors of bringing all this more to public attention is what I would call the kind of means, motive, and opportunity, to use the analogy of a murder mystery. The first thing is, if you look at the means, there's the capability out there now for people who don't like what we're doing in dairy and in livestock farming. In terms of technology, the use of social media as a medium, and the sophistication of how they now operate. They're incredibly sophisticated, and they will support followers to get campaigns going. They're very well organized. Their communication skills are incredible. I'm always in awe of what they actually do from a professional capacity. And so these are really bringing challenges in terms of gaining that very emotive footage and spreading it, disseminating it, and gaining traction. Then there's the global narrative, which is changing. And I would say this is kind of the motive. It's very, very obviously focused on climate change and the role of ruminants in particular in climate change. And this is being fueled by commercial interests as well. Whatever is happening organically is also fueled by these interests. And also this concern over animal sentience. We're seeing research finding increasing number of animals having sentience, cephalopods, all sorts of awareness now of research into animal sentience and concerns that we are treating animals in a way that meets their needs and is appropriate according to their abilities to experience pain, pleasure, distress, and so on. And then we have the opportunity. Society is changing really quite quickly. We have urbanization, which is a massive part of this, and we've seen in the UK the drift away into population growth in cities and people's removal from the land, and the number of people who have connections with rural industries and with farming is reducing. And in countries where, I know in Ireland, for example, with a smaller population, there's still a lot of rural contact. and people who have relatives in farming, but this is changing rapidly for everybody. And also we have the so-called next generation, Gen Z, who are well documented to have different attitudes, and attitudes that may not change as they have done in previous generations, far more focused on equality and fairness, and this includes towards animals. And also rising disposable income standard of living. And it's well established as well that as disposable income rises, so does concern about animal welfare. So these are the things we're up against. And when we look at the impact that's having, this is the kind of thing we're seeing now in the UK, is the positioning of artificial insemination as rape. And it's a really hard one to argue, actually, because if you weren't going to think about it that way, the cow does not give consent. And if people are framing it that way, it is a really difficult one to counter. The cow-calf separation, a lot of campaign groups are really focusing on mothers, which is really gaining traction in our country. I'm concerned about cow-calf separation, and there's a lot more discussion and concern around that. We obviously have bull-calf euthanasia, which we're trying very hard as an industry to eliminate, because that has been an issue, and we have a lot of movement in our industry to tackle that, but it doesn't solve the problem of what we do with these calves, with surplus calves. And then housing year round is still an issue, and the thought that cows who are meant to graze outside do not graze outside. So these are issues which are standard practice, which are really coming under scrutiny now. So not just malpractice or poor practice, standard practice. So thinking about what impact this might have on our industry, I feel that we very much focused on what it does to our sales. And yes, that obviously is a huge part of the concern, and we've got to make sure that we don't impact on sales through some of these narratives. But if a consumer doesn't like what we're doing, what do? Well, they have the option to stop buying dairy. But what we find in research is that things like price and freshness and taste really can override that. So people can put up with quite a large amount of discomfort about the way something is produced if things like the price override that. And we see, in fact, that global dairy consumption is still forecast to rise over the next decade, even in established mature dairy markets like Europe and the US. It may be changing from more liquid milk to processed products or fresh products, but it's still predicted to hold or to rise. So should we be worried? Well, yes, I think we should, because if a citizen doesn't like what we're doing, rather than a consumer, we start seeing this withdrawal of the social license to operate, which is a great term founded in Australia around the mining industry, but we're increasingly using it here, because if the social license to operate, the tacit permission a community gives an industry or an operation to conduct its business, if that withdraws, we will start to see things like activism and incursions, retailers making more and more demands, new legislation. We have an animal sentience bill running through Parliament at the moment, and growing planning constraints. We are seeing all of these in the UK. We're seeing all of these in Europe. And I would argue this is a diminishing social license to operate. And that actually could lead to significant business disruption. It is already. So we maybe should stop thinking solely in terms of sales and be thinking about, are we doing things that people actually feel supported about? Are people feeling good about dairy farming? I think this is where we need to start thinking and moving towards. So what can we do about this situation? Well, this is where I'm trying to combine some of my experience with issues and crisis management with also some of my research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about issues and crisis management first. This is looks a bit complicated, but I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but if not, there's a box down on the bottom left, which is issues management, early issue identification. So if you look at this line that's coming from the left, which is jogging along at a level rate, that's the pressure any issue would present. So it may be that you're seeing a little bit of discussion around environmental impact of something, and there's a little bit of media coverage, there's a little bit of people talking about it, and it's jogging along, creating a certain amount of pressure. What happens is this pressure starts to rise as the issue develops, and then it reaches a critical point where it's hitting social and mainstream media, most likely, and it just takes off. And traditionally, when an issue takes off, it gets to a point where it hits this formal constraints here, where it peaks and something will happen to bring it back under control. So if it's a pollution issue, it might be an enforcement notice from the Environmental Protection Agency. And then that brings it back under control, so it falls back down. So this here, this box, is our opportunity to control issues. If we don't spot issues coming along and deal with them there, they can get completely out of control. So this is where we need to be managing issues, is we need to be spotting these issues and managing them proactively to stop them taking off. And increasingly, I believe we're not just seeing formal constraints, we're seeing informal constraints happening to take issues back down. And these could be a delisting from a supermarket, it could be withdrawal of farm assurance, which makes your product impossible to sell. So we need to be really thinking about how we tackle these issues proactively in that box. The second thing I would say is we need to accept and own concerns over welfare. This is a survey that was done a couple of years ago by our levy board, AHTB. And what it shows is in the left-hand column there at the bottom, it says humane treatment of farm animals was as important as issues like rising energy costs, COVID, state of our National Health Service, pollution from plastic waste, global warming. Now, this was a couple of years ago. Some of these other issues have got even worse in the meantime, but it does show there is really a high level of concern over humane treatment of farm animals. Next thing I would say we need to think about is we need to recognise that we see welfare differently from the public. And if we ask the question, what is good welfare? There's been some great research done to show that farmers tend to see good welfare as focusing on regular care based on habit and good intention. So day in, day out, doing right by that animal, making sure she's clean, making sure she's well fed. And that is good welfare in the eyes of a farmer. If you turn instead to look at a scientist, and I would probably include a vet in here, is they tend to focus on metrics and outcomes, biological parameters. And if farmers work closely with their vet, they will probably focus on some of these issues as well. If we look at animal welfare campaign groups, they just want naturalness, and they're not bothered about the economic viability of what they're asking for. But if we look at the public don't have the level of knowledge that some of these other groups have. So what they tend to do is focus on icons and symbols of good welfare like space and straw and outdoor access. So quite often we can see this disconnect happening where farming industry is talking about its level of regular, consistent care, about good feeding and all these kind of things, where actually this misses the public completely because they want these big ticket items that represent good welfare to them. So that tells us that we need to start thinking about more how the public see welfare rather than how we communicate welfare on our terms. So in my research, one of the first things I did is I set out to, knowing all this then, I set out to do a survey of 2,000 people to find out more about what they felt was important in terms of how we manage a cow and produce milk. And from this survey, we found there were 6 groups, and these 6 groups all had different priorities. So there was a group that was very focused on welfare, and they had characteristically different from a different group that for example, prioritized cow comfort. And what this showed is that we actually have quite a lot of diversity in the population in the UK, where people have different priorities. And some people don't really bother that much about the cow. They want great tasting milk. Others want a fair price paid to farmers. So this was interesting because it did show this level of diversity. And sometimes we get very obsessed with, what do people want? They want this. Well, actually, people don't want one thing. There's a real diversity within that. But what we then realized is that doesn't actually give us the whole story. We've got to also look at what lies underneath that. What perception of dairy farming were people basing their views on? What was their understanding of the terms we used? We gave them a whole load of parameters and asked them to rank them. So what did they understand by things like cow comfort and health and welfare? And what did they think would be achieved by them? And also, what about the things we left out of that list of nearly 20 different attributes that they had to rank? So we then took 60 people from that group and we interviewed them in one-to-one interviews to try and understand some other aspects of their views of dairy farming and cow management. So the next thing we did was look at how they frame dairy farming. Now, frames are our frames of reference. So whenever you have a new experience, you will revert back to frames of reference you've got to make sense of this new experience. So when we ask people questions, they will use their frames of reference. So how do they think about dairy farming? And we found from the interviews that they see dairy farming sort of depicted in as two different identities. One is the cow, one is the farmer, which is fair enough. So the cow and the farmer are 2 main entities involved in dairy farming. What was interesting is they saw the cow in 3 different ways. So they saw her, first of all, as enduring and really put upon poor cow, if you like. And this meant they felt a moral responsibility for her. So they feel, whether they consume dairy or not, that they feel a moral responsibility for that animal because she's out there producing milk for our society. The second thing they felt about her was she was kind of a fellow, a companion. And in the UK, when we drive around on the roads, we see cows in fields all the time. And people grow up with that feeling of cows. It's culturally a very strong identity, is this feeling of cows in fields, in green fields, black and white cows in green fields. Quite often people who've been on a farm stay when they're growing up and they've kind of made a connection with cows. And there's this real feeling of fellowship, if you like. And the third way they saw her was as this sort of unknowable force of nature, great big animal. She can be aggressive, but also she can be really connected with nature. So they saw her in lots of different ways. And some people sort of saw her in all three ways at the same time. Then in terms of the farmer, they saw the farmer in two ways, very much as a traditional farmer or a modernizing farmer. And both of these, though, interestingly, were both positive and negative. So the traditional farmer was seen as, very much caring for animals, knowing them all individually, but also sometimes being out of their depth, economically unviable, and therefore the cows might suffer as a result. And that was the positive and negative. And equally on the modernizing side, they saw the farmer, the great big factory farms, soulless environment, commoditized cows, and that was the negative side. But equally, they saw farmers using data and diversifying, and they saw that as a positive side. So what was interesting is the positive and negative sides depended on how the farmer treated the cow. So the cow was really, really important in defining whether the modernizing or the traditional farmer was seen positively or negatively. So the cow comes back to the center of all of this. And in fact, you can see some of these frames in the media. During the pandemic, people were talking about cow cuddling. They couldn't cuddle their friends, their family, and they actually were going to these sanctuary farms and being next to cows and feeling a kind of sense of peace from being next to a cow. And equally, this is a farmer in the UK, David Christensen. This was a feature from him in the Times, was about his use of data to look after the welfare of his cows. So that was a positive framing of the modernizing farmer. So this tells us that people actually in the UK have big connections to the cow. The cow is quite a kind of a prominent feature in their minds. They feel a connection to her. And this shows they feel they have a stake in what happens to cows. They don't want to be dismissed. And we quite often dismiss them. We diminish what people say and say, well, you don't actually know what you're talking about. You don't have the technical knowledge. You're anthropomorphizing. You're being naive. Well, actually, maybe we should listen a bit to people and give them a bit of respect for what they think, because they are a stakeholder in this as well. And farmers are also judged by concern for the cow, as I said. So people want to see that farmers care for cows in ways that they understand. So back to that earlier slide, people look at icons and symbols of good welfare. So they want to see farmers caring in ways that they understand. Another piece of research we did with these 60 people was to try and understand what systems they preferred in terms of how we house and manage cows. And these are three basic systems in the UK. So a mixed system where the cows are housed in the winter and out in the summer, cow system where they're housed year round, and a grey system where they're grazed year round, they just come in for milking. So as part of this research to look at how people viewed these three systems and what they felt they meant to the cow, meant to the farmer, or why a farmer would do that, what we found is that people actually saw the cow as both domestic and wild. So she's actually always, she was a wild animal to start with. We've domesticated her. We kind of owe her something for that. So she needs protection from us, but she also needs the access to naturalness because she was originally a wild animal. It shows that they have views on a cow's needs. They may be completely irrelevant views, but they still have views, and to people, those views are important. They have a perspective. People don't. So other people said they don't actually know how a cow should live. This is what came out in the research. So what they do is they fill in gaps. So when deciding which of those three systems they preferred, they filled in gaps, thinking, well, which one would make most sense? They used memories and experiences and media images. So they drew down those images they'd seen of a great big factory farm. They anthropomorphized. They said, well, if I was a cow, how would I want to live? Or they said, look, I don't know, but I'm going to let the farmer decide. I'm going to let the government decide. I'm going to let farm assurance schemes decide. And I'm also going to let the cow decide. So this gave an impression that basically people we can give them new memories, experiences, images that they can trust. If we can do that, we can actually help to shape a bit about what their views are, what they think is good for the animal, or also cow-centric systems. If the cow can make choices, they will trust that. They will trust a farmer that they trust as well. So it's all about thinking, what do people trust and how do we make them feel more comfortable about what we're doing? So back to my PR side, I'm thinking, how do we use these insights to change how we communicate with the public? So I've applied them to issues management. And there's four key things I always go back to in issues management is how can we be accountable? How can we be transparent? How can we be relatable? And how can we take action? And those are four things that really work. If we go back to that graph of the early intervention in an issue and how we get it back under control, is think about these four things to help that. So applying some of the learnings I've had from my research into this sort of model, if we are going to think about how we are more accountable in dairy farming, how can we respect public preferences? They may not always be appropriate or suitable, but can we respect and engage more and listen and give them that sort of opportunity to input into what we're doing? And where it might be possible, maybe we could change. Also, do we own our issues enough? So many times I see this, oh, everything is perfect in dairy farming. We're doing this, we're doing that. No talk about some of the challenges. Well, people aren't naive. They know there are challenges. So do we own our issues? Are we upfront about them? Are we getting out there first and making sure we are owning them and we're tackling them rather than just denying they exist? And also, are we doing enough to make sure we don't get caught out? I mean, the frustration about that expose we had was that really, do we need to get caught out like that? Are we doing everything right? Are we thinking that all this capability, these modern cameras, all the things that are happening now that enable these exposes, are we making sure we're doing our job right and thinking about reducing those opportunities to be caught out? And then transparency. If we could increase familiarity with what we do and fill the gaps ourselves, that then stops other people, the public, filling gaps with information that's incorrect or information that we don't want. So it's a frustration to me when I go and Google something is there's very little from the industry to answer that question. There's a whole lot from animal welfare campaign groups. So where are people getting their information from? And again, being honest about the challenges we face, being transparent and basically sharing them and working on them and telling people what we're doing to work on them. If we look at relatability, again, another frustration is certainly in the UK, I see a lot of narrative around how early farmers get up, how hard they work, how different they are from everyone else in society. If you ate today, thank a farmer. And I just think this doesn't sit well with the public. We need to be relatable. They need to see us as them. They need to understand what we do through their eyes, through things that they can relate to. So how do we share values and common goals rather than emphasizing our differences? And also, can we find good brand ambassadors that can come to represent what the industry means, that people can relate to rather than just allowing them to develop their own impressions? And lastly, action. Are we taking action? Are we listening? Are we responding? Are we anticipating what's happening to get ahead? And are we visibly and demonstrably acting on our issues and keeping acting on our issues, always trying to do better? Unfortunately, this will need change. So that's the big issue here. That's the kicker, is if we're going to do this, we need to change our attitude. We probably need to change how we communicate, and we might need to change our systems and how we farm too, within reason, to try and accommodate some of these concerns if we're going to start gaining that social license. The question is, if we change, will it work? Well, just in these last few slides, it does work. At the introduction, it was mentioned I worked on antibiotic issues. We've had a 5-year plan in the UK to actually turn around and face this issue and say, yeah, we use antibiotics and we are part of the problem and we can be part of the solution. Let's work on it together. And through changing our attitude and actually setting our own targets and being very open and transparent and publishing this information, we're now a case study from the United Nations FAO about how we've managed to do this voluntarily. And it's great to see our former chief medical officer, who was very, very critical of the industry, say she can't say how proud she is of our farmers. We just got on with it. So to have that kind of endorsement really does help to frame us in a different way. The fact that we've got on and we've actually engaged with this, we've been open and transparent and put information out there. How relatable are we? This was a great tweet I saw from a couple of years ago where a Massey Ferguson tractor was branded up in rainbow colours and taken to our gay pride festival in Brighton. And to see them saying that farmers have such a positive story to tell, the public adore us when we engage on society's terms rather than our own. So show that, we do have gay farmers, like there are gay people in society. So yeah, come and see what we do. People can then relate. We say we need to attract more people into our industry, where if we say we're an open, diverse industry, welcoming of people, then that sort of changes society's perceptions. There's a farmer called Tom Pemberton who runs a social media channel, YouTube channel, and he has 1 million followers. This video actually had 3 million views. And what was great is he put a cow brush in, and the cows interacted with it. And he was so excited about how the cows interacted with it and the pleasure they got from it. What was interesting is in the many comments under the video, people responding to the fact that he was really enjoying watching the cows get pleasure out of that brush. And this is back to my points, is people want to see farmers caring about the cows and caring about what they do. And that gives them a feeling that someone is looking after the cows on their behalf. And just before Christmas, we did a talk. Three of us did a talk together at an event, and Alison Russell, who is a colleague of mine at University of Nottingham, has done a whole load of work on cow behaviour and enrichment. And we were talking about the benefits of enrichment, and how if you make the cows, you show the cows enjoying something, that is positive for public perceptions, that you're putting in extra effort to make sure cows actually are getting pleasure out of life, as well as helping the cows themselves and helping us engage more widely. And the great news is, I just was talking to a Nuffield scholar the other day from the UK who's come back from Australia, and she was lucky enough to sit in on this course, which is run by the Meat and Livestock Australia. And this is great because this is happening in Australia now. And I've got to admit, some of the work that Dairy Australia does, we look at and say, this is brilliant. We want some of that. But this is the Meat and Livestock Australia. And they're running engagement courses with farmers to look at insights into how, first of all, what is actually happening? How do people view red meat? So farmers have got the knowledge. And then understanding how, value centered communications. How can we communicate what we do and share our values? How can we use social media? How can we communicate better? And these are the core skills to do with becoming relatable, accountable, transparent, and taking action. And it's great to see this is happening in Australia, and I'm desperate to know more about it. So, it is happening out there. And I think this is something we really need to think about in the future if we're going to start tackling some of these issues. So just to conclude, the future is about more than dairy sales. It's about being a valued part of society. I think we need to think about how we change that lens at the moment, away from just focusing purely on production to actually how do we fit in and meet society's needs. We need to treat consumer and public views, concerns and wants with respect. Let's not dismiss them in the way we have been. Let's also talk a language people understand and can act on the things they care about within reason, not to the detriment of the cow or the farm business, but can we actually meet in the middle somewhere? Being relatable is better than being different. And times are changing, and we need to change to get ahead and stay ahead of the game. All I can say is let's not be this guy with his ladder. Let's turn that ladder around and make life a lot easier for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for the fantastic presentation and taking us through, I think, something that's going to be relatable to us all. At the moment, I'm not garnering any questions, so that means you've done. I've got a comment from Lucy. I know plenty of amazing female large animal vets, and I'm not sure where we're, that. And Mark, and I've got this is a question from one of our audience saying, can we educate the public, or are we doomed to public perceptions?
I think the very point of educating is where we're going wrong, because educating is about expecting everyone to change to suit us. And I think, do we stand a chance of doing that? I mean, it's great if we can, but I would suggest that we don't actually stand a chance of changing everyone. I think our best opportunity is to engage. And engagement is about meeting in the middle. And by meeting in the middle and sharing values gives us a chance to explain a bit about what we do, for them to explain what concerns them, and for us to think about how we can both change to meet in the middle. I think we need to move away from this concept of education to one of engagement, because we are pushing water uphill if we think we are going to go out there and educate everyone to accept what we want them to accept and exactly the way we're doing it. It's just not going to happen. So that's what I would say. We have a much better chance of engaging rather than educating.
And another question was, how can we address the animal welfare concerns about voluntary culling of low-producing cows?
It's really difficult. I mean, that's a very specific point. I think in general, we have a problem with our standard practices that help our industry be economically viable. I don't have an answer to that specifically, but I would say there was Nina von Kieseling is a researcher from the University of British Columbia, and she made a really good point about cow-calf separation, which isn't your issue you're talking about here, but is another implicit part of the industry. And what she said is, look, the way we talk about it sometimes doesn't help, because we just say, well, that's the way it is. That's part of our industry. That's the way we have to do it. She said, instead, let's acknowledge people are concerned. Yeah, we hear your concern. We understand it's something that people feel really worried about. We don't have an answer yet, but we're working on it. We're looking at this. We're doing research on this, whatever. Now, early culling, I don't know how much research you can do. I don't know how you can change that. But I think sometimes we need to acknowledge some things we do in the industry aren't necessarily acceptable or people feel deeply uncomfortable about. I think sometimes we need to just maybe acknowledge those concerns and look at how can we make it better and say, we are working on it. We don't have an answer yet, but we are working on it. And that's all I can say. So sorry, I don't have an answer, but maybe sometimes we change our narrative a little bit.
And the last question, perhaps next issues? Have you something that's already come up on the horizon from the UK industry perspective that is sitting out there waiting to be addressed?
I think, greenhouse gas emissions is obviously a massive issue for you guys too. I'm actually quite worried about artificial insemination. I think I worry about the industry putting pictures of arms up cows' backsides on social media. I'm thinking this doesn't translate well to people. I think we just need to be careful about the optics of what we do. So I think artificial insemination worries me. And actually, a concerning development in Oregon in the US is that they have their midterm elections and they have items on the ballot. And there was a big move to try and get an item on the ballot last year, which was around getting rid of the derogation that farming has on animal protection laws. So animal protection laws stop killing of animals, sexual abuse of animals, all those kind of things. There was actually a move to try and remove that derogation that would mean you couldn't AI, you couldn't slaughter animals and so on. Now, look, that seems far away, but there's a big societal move. So I think we do have to be really careful and think about how we present ourselves and become more trusted so that maybe people trust some of our practices better, and maybe not just post pictures of us with big grins on our face AIing a cow, because that just doesn't come over well. I think just more awareness about what we do and how that is portrayed, how we portray it.
No, thank you. Well, I'd like everyone to put their hands together for AIM. It's been an incredibly insightful presentation about some of the areas that we're probably in the middle of, if I ask some of David's crew. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. It's all in front of you, and it gets more than B-2.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me be between you and the bar, so I shall let you all go now for the end of the day.
Thanks very much.